Hello class, and welcome to part 2 of supply and demand, where we're looking at supply. Now, supply is very similar to demand. With demand, we're looking at the quantity that is demanded for a given price. Namely, what we're doing is we're looking at the behavior of buyers, people who are buying the product. With supply, we're looking at what the sellers are doing, the other side of the equation. So remember last week we talked about a market as being a place where buyers and sellers meet. We're now looking at the seller. How many units of the product are the sellers willing to sell for a given price? Now this will look very similar to demand, but in the opposite direction. It will have a supply curve which will go in the opposite direction to the demand curve. Now, I'll show this to you in due course. But there was a question that was raised by one of you, one of the students, only earlier this week, that the last lecture, demand, and subsequently this lecture, supply, we're not really looking into engineering as such. And that's true. The examples I'm giving you are not really civil engineering orientated. The lectures on supply and demand and scarcity in markets, in a way, they are fairly generic and they're Economics 101 courses. However, you need to know this in order to understand some of the more civil engineering orientated applications that we're going to be looking at in the later part of the course. So let's get underway. So a question for you: what is supply? Well, if demand is basically the number of people who are able and willing to buy a product at various prices, supply is basically the number of units that sellers are willing and able to supply for given prices. So it is the amount of a product that a seller is willing and able to sell at a variety of prices. So that may sound like a bit of a mouthful, but let's see what it looks like on a graph. So first off, we need to get familiar with certain terms. So remember, last time we talked about the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Demand is the curve itself, whereas quantity demanded is the point on the curve and its subsequent x-axis value. So how many units are being demanded is the quantity demanded, whereas demand is an expression on the buyer behavior for given prices. And it's the same with supply. Supply is the curve itself, seller behavior for given prices, whereas quantity supplied is the amount of the good and service that a firm is willing and able to supply at a given price. So it is the point on the supply curve and the x value. So remember we talked about the demand schedule being a table made up of different prices for a product and the quantity that is demanded for the product. We can also do the same with a supply schedule. Prices for a product versus the quantity that sellers are willing to sell the product for. And then from the supply schedule, you can form a supply curve to show the relationship. Now, that will be like the demand curve, but in the opposite direction. And I'll show that to you in due course. So let's now start doing this. I want to give you an example of web design. Now, if you ever want to start a business or start an organization, if it's going to have any sort of professional recognition, you need to have a professional looking website. You can't just use a social media page like Facebook. And because of that, there is a demand for web designers, people who design websites. An old term for them is webmasters. Now, there is people in Errible who work as webmasters or web designers, and they will design you a website for different prices. Now, generally, I think the price for a website design can vary quite a lot. But remember what we said in demand, that when we're doing a demand curve, we're assuming that all other variables are the same. So the only variables that change are quantity demanded and price. So even though there is differences in quality of websites designed, and that will be reflected in the price, right now we're just going to assume that there is only one kind of website and there's only one price. And that will teach you the concept of supply. So, first things first, we have a supply schedule. Let's say that the given price of a website to be designed is $250. Now that would mean that in terms of quantity, there will be the webmasters of Errible will design 45 websites every week. And we can put that on the graph, and you can see that on the point below. Now, if it was $300 per website, suddenly the webmasters, the web designers, they're going to be more willing to make websites, and so 50 websites will be made every week. As the price of the website increases, so the quantity of websites that suppliers are willing to supply increases. And we can do this all the way along, and we can then plot it with a curve that goes through all of the points, and we have what you call a supply curve. Now, it's not a curve there, is it? It's a straight line. Just be aware that just like the demand curve, in the real world, they always will have some level of curvature. If all of the webmasters of Errible, if they worked as hard as they possibly could, and they could only produce an absolute maximum of 100 websites a week, well, it doesn't matter if the price is $500 or $1,000 for a website. They're not going to be able to go beyond 100 websites a week. So what that will look like is curvature. The line will get steeper as it goes to the absolute maximum capacity. It will curve upwards. And just like the demand curve, there's curvature to it. Now, the other thing you should notice is that with the supply curve, it's in the opposite direction to the demand curve. The demand curve, as the price went down, the quantity demanded went up. But with supply, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. So, that's a supply curve. That is the supply side of the market. That's the seller's side of the market. So remember, the law of supply, that if everything else is equal, meaning that the quality of the product is the same, there isn't any other variation, an increase in price will cause an increase in the quantity supplied, and a decrease in price will cause a decrease in the quantity supplied. And so you end up having a line with the supply curve that goes up. As the y value increases, so does the x value, which is the opposite of the law of demand. So, we have the curve that goes like that with supply. It's going up. Now, what would happen if, say, suddenly we have more people willing to become webmasters. There were people thinking, boy, there's a lot of money to be made being a webmaster and making websites. Well, that's going to lead to a shift in supply to the right. This is called an increase in supply. Now, what would happen if there were a lot of webmasters, but for whatever reason, a lot of them died? Let's say that all of the webmasters were based in Ainkawa, which I understand is sort of like the IT center for Erbil, and the coronavirus hit Ainkawa really bad, and a lot of the webmasters died. Well, the supply will decrease, and that is shown by a shift in the supply curve to the left. So, what are some of the things that can change supply? Well, one of the things that can change supply would be something like the price of inputs. Now, let's say to be a webmaster, what is one of the inputs you need to buy? Well, one of the inputs is clearly internet. I can tell you that I buy my internet, which is fairly slow. It's only about 5 megabytes per second. I'm paying 25,000 dinar a month for that. What would happen if Korek decided that they wanted to up the price to 50,000 dinar per month? Well, there's going to be a big decrease in the supply of websites that webmasters are willing to offer. If the price stays the same, the webmasters are not going to offer the same quantity of websites. They will be less willing and able to make websites for the given price if the cost of their inputs increase. Another example could be a technological change. Now, this could be both a positive or negative change, meaning that the supply of websites that webmasters in Erbil are able to offer could increase or it could decrease. So let's give you an example that increasingly websites need to be smartphone friendly, because most people are viewing the World Wide Web by smartphone rather than PC. Now, back in 2009, when I was a young man and I was studying for my degree in a Bachelor of Engineering in the University of Auckland, we used laptops for everything. And that was the way I viewed the internet. And then I think it was in 2011, iPhone developed the iPhone 1, and very slowly over the next 2 years, everyone got a smartphone. Now suddenly, all of the webmasters, they needed to relearn how to make websites that were friendly for smartphones, because a website that is good for a laptop is not good for a smartphone. And this is one of the big issues with IT, is software development often is lagging behind and needs to catch up with hardware development. With this technological change, the development of the smartphone, suddenly there were much fewer webmasters available who knew how to make websites that were smartphone friendly. And so the supply, the quantity of websites that webmasters could offer for a given price decreased. Likewise, technological changes can have a positive change in supply. They can increase supply. So one of the things is the development of web design software such as Dreamweaver and other things. Suddenly, it used to be that a webmaster, he used to have to study for 3-4 years at a university and get very good at designing websites. Now with these easier technologies, just about anyone can become a very good website designer with about 6 weeks of practice using these software for website design. Now, if that's the case, then suddenly the supply, the number of websites that webmasters are willing to supply and able to supply for a given price will increase. The supply increases. That is how a technological change can both increase supply or decrease supply. Now, another example would be the price of substitutes in production. Now, this is very similar to the effect that substitutes have in demand on the demand side of a market, but the supply side, it's a little bit different because it's a substitute for what the sellers can produce rather than what the buyers can buy. So an example in the case of webmasters who design websites, they've got a lot of skills. Now, one of their great skills is graphic design. What happens if suddenly the price that is being offered and being paid to graphic designers for making video games or movie special effects increases? Suddenly, all those people who were working making websites, they're going to say, you know what? We can make a lot more money if we do special effects for Hollywood, or if we do graphic design for YouTube videos or something like that. And they will no longer be able and willing to supply websites to the same extent. A lot of the webmasters will move over into another field where they are using their skills in graphic design. Another substitute could be IT help desks. Now, I don't know how much the IT guys at the UKH University earn. I don't know what is the given salary for an IT person at a company. But let's say, for argument's sake, they're all making $1,000 a month. Let's say that's the standard salary for an IT person. It's probably a bit more than that, but just for example. Now, what will happen if, because of demand and changes in the market, suddenly the salary for IT help desk people goes up to $3,000 a month or $4,000 a month? Are webmasters going to want to continue to work at home making websites for $300 a website? No, they all want to work for the big companies and become IT help desk people. They can use the same skill set in the production of something else, namely offering IT consultation and help. So the price of substitutes affects the supply. So if the price of an IT help desk person, meaning his salary, goes up, then the supply of websites in the website market will decrease. The curve will shift to the left. And then also the number of firms in the market. Let's say, for argument's sake, there are currently 200 people in Erbil who are making a living off designing websites. That's what they do. Well, let's say they're selling websites at an average price of $300 a website. Now, if things change, and this could be associated with a technological change, but let's say that a lot of people are thinking, boy, $300 a website, that's good and easy money. I can do that. That's way easier than studying civil engineering at UKH. What would happen is a lot of people will drop out of university, they'll leave their jobs, and they will become new webmasters. There will be more webmasters in the market. That means the supply, the quantity supplied for a given price, will increase, and the supply curve will shift to the right. Again, if the number of firms in the market decreases, that will be a decrease in the supply. And then also expected future prices. Remember, we talked about this in demand as well. So at the moment, we're going through an economic crisis, and that will mean there will be a lot more poorer people in the next year. That will mean that the price of certain goods, such as websites, will come down in price. What does that mean for if you're a webmaster today? Well, you're probably going to be willing to make more websites today while the price is high, rather than wait for the price to go small. To give another example, if you expect the price of bananas to come down because the Philippines is developing a new breed of banana and they're going to be importing this banana into Iraq, and you're a banana salesman in the market, you're going to try and sell all of your bananas this week before the price drops and the price comes down. So that would lead to a change in the supply. There would be an increase in supply if there is an expectation the future price is going to be lower. There will be a decrease in supply if the future price is expected to be higher. Now, if none of that's clear to you, we're going to look at examples as we go on. So, let's see, what are some of the things which would cause the supply curve to shift to the right, meaning there will be an increase in supply? Well, one of those things could be a change in productivity. Remember what I said about website design? It used to be that website design work was very slow and cumbersome. You had to basically design a website off first principles using computer programming software like JavaScript or C++, and it took a long time to design a website. These days you've got specialized software like Dreamweaver and MS Web, and you can design a website much quicker. That means that the cost of producing a website goes down, which means you can now offer more quantity for a given price. What would happen if the number of firms in the market increased? If last year there were 200 webmasters in Erbil and this year there's 300 webmasters, well, the number of websites that can be produced for a given price will increase for every given price. That is an increase in supply. Now, let's look at things that would change supply in the negative. It will decrease supply. Well, one of those things could be the price of an input. You've got to have good internet connection to design a website. What would happen if the price of the internet increased? Well, webmasters are going to be less willing and able to design a website for a given price. That means the quantity that they are willing to supply will decrease. What if the price of a substitute in production occurs? Well, the example I gave you was if the price of the substitute was the salary of an IT help desk person. If that went up for whatever reason, all of the webmasters will want to quit being website designers and they want to now use their same skill set, a substitute in the production of IT consultancy, offering IT help to the big companies. That is going to lead to a decrease in the number of websites that can be offered at a given price at every price, or the expectation of a future price of a product. So let's forget about websites for now. Let's talk about gold, for example. This is a good one because it's associated with civil engineering and the mining industry. let's say you work on a gold mine and you have all of this gold that you've just mined. Now, your job is to sell it, and then that's your salary. Well, if you think the price of gold is going to go up next year, by the way, if you understand economics and the current events with the pandemic, I can assure you it will. The price of gold will go up. You're going to say, actually, I don't want to sell the gold just yet. I'm going to keep it. I'm just going to hold on to it, and next year maybe I will sell it. Well, the supply of gold for the current time will decrease. There will be less people willing to sell gold for every given price because they think there'll be a higher price in the future. And that can be vice versa. If there's a lower price in the future that is expected, they're going to try and sell all of their gold now while the price is high. So remember what we talked about in demand, that we mustn't confuse a change in demand with a change in quantity demanded. The same is true with supply and quantity supplied. A change in supply is where the whole curve, the supply curve, moves. It moves left or it moves right. A change in the quantity supplied is a move up and down the curve. So here we have an example of initially the supply of a product is A. When the price is $200, suddenly there's 40 million people willing to supply the product. 14 million units that can be supplied of the product. But if the price were to increase to $250, suddenly the number of units that people are willing to supply, the sellers are willing to supply, is 45 million, and it moves up the curve. That is a shift in quantity supplied, where a change in price moves the dot along the curve. It's different to a change in supply. A change in supply would be something like we just looked at, where the supply curve moves to the right if it's an increase in supply, or to the left if it's a decrease in supply. So, some question time for you. What are the factors that determine a movement along the supply curve? Well, it's a change in price. That's the only thing. If the price goes up, the quantity supplied will go up. If the price goes down, the quantity supplied will go down. A shift in the supply curve, where the whole supply curve moves, well, that could be a number of variables, which we looked at. The technology changes, substitutes in production, the expected future prices, more firms entering the market or less firms entering the market. Those things lead to a change in supply. So remember this, do not confuse quantity supplied with supply, and do not confuse quantity demanded with demand. I say this every year I teach this course, and every year there are students who don't get it, and it's very important that you understand that. If it's still unclear to you, talk to me privately by phone call or tutorial. We can arrange a Skype call. I can try and show it to you on a whiteboard. Now, we're going to move on to a couple of a new thing, which is called market equilibrium. And this is basically the interface between supply and demand, where what would happen if we put the supply and the demand curve on the same graph. They would intersect, wouldn't they? And if you have a competitive market, meaning that there's no government regulation and the price is basically set by the buyers and sellers themselves, then you have what's called market equilibrium. The equilibrium is the intersection between the demand and the supply curve, and market equilibrium is what happens when you have a competitive market. So here we've got the supply curve and the demand curve. So I don't know what let's say again we're looking at let's say we're looking at gold. We're civil engineers, and we've used our civil engineering skills to open up a gold mine in Bauzan. I believe there's gold in Bauzan, according to Mr. Farajan. So if you do that, you're going to have you're going to be looking at the international market for gold. Now, the amount of gold that people are willing to buy will depend on the price, and that's shown with the demand curve, the blue line. And the amount of gold people are willing to supply will go up with the price. That is shown by the supply curve, the red line. So currently, where they intersect is the price of gold. It's $200 a gram. I believe it's about that, actually. It's probably a bit less than that. I believe it's about I believe that gold is about, currently, I think it's about $1,200 per Egmont, which is about 120 grams from memory. So it's about $10 per gram of gold. But anyway, we don't know what the unit is here. This could be probably price per 10 grams of gold, let's say. Now, that would mean that in the world, 40 kilograms of gold are demanded every week. Again, don't worry about units. You just need to understand the concept here. You don't need to use a calculator in this course for the most part. Now, that point is called market equilibrium. That means that if someone tried to sell gold, a supplier tried to sell gold for a higher price than $200 at the market, at the gold souk, no one's going to buy it, because they say, why would we buy gold for $250 when all the other gold around us in the marketplace is $200? Likewise, if there is a seller who's selling gold for $150, if he's quick about it, he's going to say, whoa, wait a minute, everyone around me is buying gold for $200, I need to put my price up. And so every time, buyers and sellers, they descend to the market equilibrium. And this is a place which is on the demand curve as well, meaning that buyers are willing to buy the same quantity as suppliers are willing to supply at that price, but at no other price. If the price was higher, there would be more people willing to sell gold than there would be people willing to buy it. If the price was lower, there would be less people willing to sell gold than the people willing to buy it. So that is where the price will always tend to in a free competitive market, to the market equilibrium. And the $200, that's called the equilibrium price, and the 40 there, the 40 kilograms per week, that's the equilibrium quantity. So remember, the market equilibrium is where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and from that we can determine what is the equilibrium price. Now, if the market is competitive, meaning that there's no barrier for sellers and buyers to enter the market, there's no government regulation, then the market equilibrium will bounce around according to buyer and seller behavior. And if it's competitive, there will be lots of buyers and lots of sellers, meaning that Buyers can, if a seller's trying to sell gold for more, the buyer can just go down the road and buy gold for a cheaper price. He's not restricted to the sellers he's dealing with. And if a buyer was refusing to buy gold at the equilibrium price, the seller doesn't need to feel obligated because he knows there will be other buyers who will come along and pay at the market equilibrium. So remember, demand and supply they determine what is the market equilibrium. That means that both suppliers, sellers, and buyers have equal control over what the market price is. Now, if you have a competitive market, you're going to have an elimination of surpluses and shortages. What do I mean by a surplus? Well, a surplus is where the quantity being supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. Let's say that if we have gold being produced from a mine, and we're currently at the given price of $250 for an ounce of gold. We're currently producing 45 tons of gold. That's what we are willing to supply. That's our quantity supplied. But demand at $250 an ounce is only 35 tons of gold a week that's being demanded. Well, that means we've got a surplus. What's going to happen to that surplus gold? We're not going to throw it out. Basically, we're going to keep lowering the price until we can sell it. And as we lower the price, more buyers will be willing to buy it. And eventually we will meet at the market equilibrium of probably 40 tons a week or whatever. A shortage is exactly the same as a surplus, but in the other direction, where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Let's say that the price of gold is currently $150 an ounce, and we're not really that willing to mine as much gold at that low price as suppliers, but lots more people are demanding gold. There'll be a lot more units of gold demanded. Well, there's not enough gold to go around everyone who wants gold, so eventually the price is going to be pushed up until it reaches the market equilibrium. Let's look at that on a graph. So here we have a graph and we have supply and demand. Now, let's say that currently that at the market equilibrium the price of gold is $200 an ounce and 40 kilograms of gold are traded every week. Well, if we have the price going as high as $250, the supply will be 45 kilograms a week, but the quantity supplied, I should have said, the quantity demanded will be 35 kilograms a week. There will be a shortfall, there will be a surplus, I should say, which means there's more gold than is needed. So gradually the price is going to decrease until it reaches the market equilibrium. There will be a surplus of 10 million or 10 kilograms above the equilibrium. And if it went down to $100, suddenly the quantity demanded would be 50 kilograms of gold, but the quantity supplied would be 30 kilograms of gold. The number of units of gold that are wanted are far greater than the number of units which are being supplied. So if you want to buy gold, you're going to start pushing the price up. And all roads lead to the equilibrium. All roads lead to Rome, that little black dot in the center. So that is a supply. That's how surpluses and shortages are eliminated in a free competitive marketplace. So one of the great things about a competitive market is that suppliers and buyers, they influence and the price. One side cannot dictate the price to another. That's the joy of a competitive market. The petrol stations can't just suddenly decide, you know what, we're going to sell petrol to you at $80 a litre, because they know no one's going to buy it at that price, or very, very few people, because the demand from the buyers, that in turn influences the price that they will set. And so the interaction of demand and supply is what determines the equilibrium price. Now, no producer can sell anything at any price unless he is able to find a willing and able buyer. And no consumer can buy anything at any price without finding a willing and able seller. And the only place where you have an equal number of willing and able buyers to willing and able sellers is at the equilibrium price. So, how are you going to answer questions that you get in the assignment or in the exam? Well, remember, it's a three-step method. First off, you are trying to determine what is leading to a shift in supply or demand. What events are happening? Is it affecting supply or demand, or is it affecting both? Or is it, and then what direction is the supply or demand moving? Is it increasing or decreasing? Is it moving right or left? And the third thing you've got to answer is, how will that affect the equilibrium price and the quantity consumed? Well, let's look at some examples later on and in the tutorial. So here we go back to the example of website design, and this is here in Errible, and you've got a demand curve and you've got a supply curve. And currently the equilibrium price is P1 and the quantity that is being consumed is Q1. Now, Belind and Hammer are getting a little bit tired of these lectures, and they think, you know what, we've got better things to do with our quarantine than study online. What we should do is start a web design company. And so they quit UKH and they start a web design company. Well, what's going to happen then? Think about that. Well, first off, you're going to have more firms entering the web design marketplace. That means the supply will increase. The supply curve will move to the right. It's not going to affect demand. Suddenly, with Belind and Hammer starting a web design company, that's not going to change buyer behavior for websites. But the supply curve moves to the right. That will bring the price of websites down. It will move from P1 to P2, which will be less. And the quantity demanded will increase. It will move from Q1 to Q2, and that will be an increase. So that is what I would be answering. You can see the increase in supply there, and then that leads to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity consumed. So that's how you would answer a typical assignment or exam question. It would probably be 3 marks. 1 mark for saying whether supply or demand will be affected and how, and then 1 mark for how the price is affected and 1 mark for how the quantity consumed is affected. So my answer would be, with Hammer and Belind starting a web design company, there will be more firms in the marketplace. Therefore, supply will increase. This will bring the price of websites down and the quantity of websites being consumed up. So there, those are the 3 elements, and I just got 3 marks. a decrease in the equilibrium price, and an increase in the equilibrium quantity. And point 1 was an increase in supply. So let's look at another example here. We are looking at the market for LCD televisions. So televisions that are LCD are the flat screen televisions. I'm pretty sure all TVs are flat screen now except mine. I've still got one of those curved televisions in my apartment, which is probably from the 1990s, and it's very old and crusty. It's not digital. Now, this is what happened with the LCD market for televisions. You can see there the demand curve for price, and you can see the supply curve and the quantity of televisions being consumed or purchased around the world. So initially, this is way back in around 2004, flat screen TVs were just becoming a thing, and they were really expensive. They were about $4,000 for a small television of no more than maybe 19 inches. And so at that price, the supply was very low. And that meant that 8 million people were buying televisions every year, because that was the equilibrium price. But over the years, I think the first company ever to make an LCD television was Sony. But through the years, gradually more firms entered into the market. They developed their own flat screen TV technology, and so Panasonic entered, so did Sharp, so did LG, so did Huawei. And there was a huge shift in supply. The supply increased, and that drove the price down considerably. And now, if you wanted a TV that was a flat screen television, you'd be paying around $1,600 a TV. This is a bit old. I think this was the average price in 2007, 2008. It's a lot lower than that even now. But you can see the demand didn't shift. But with the price from the equilibrium dropping, the quantity demanded has now gone from 8 million televisions a year to 46 million televisions a year. So that's an example from LCD televisions. So let's look at another example here where we're looking at a shift in demand. Let's say that not only has the supply of LCD televisions increased dramatically, and that's decreased the price, but also there's been a small shift in demand, meaning that as more of your neighbors are getting flat screen televisions and your friends have flat screen televisions, more people wanted them. And so there was a change in demand, an increase in demand. And so that actually had a very small effect of increasing the price and the quantity demanded. But the increase in demand was much smaller than the increase in supply. So overall, the equilibrium price still came down, but there was a big increase in the quantity demanded and quantity supplied and quantity consumed, because both the demand curve and the supply curve shifted right. So remember, demand and supply can shift over time. So let's say this is the current demand curve and supply curve for the market for printers. This is the printer market. So with the market for printers, and this is the international market, the current equilibrium is price P1, and the quantity that is consumed is Q1. That is millions of printers that are being purchased every month. Now, let's say that demand shifts first and also supply. So let's say demand increases because basically because people are working at home all around the world because of this pandemic, everyone goes out and buys printers because they can't just do their printing at work. So there's a big increase in demand. There is also an increase in supply. I don't know what might be causing that in this time, but let's say that just before the lockdown, there was a brand new company in China that was opened, and they have the ability to produce several million printers every month, and so they increased the supply a small bit. Now you can see here that the demand has increased and the supply, but the demand has increased more than the supply. So what's going to happen? The new price is going to go up. The new equilibrium price goes up because the increase in demand was greater than the increase in supply. And of course, because both are moving right, the quantity consumed increases. Now, what would happen if the supply shifted more than demand? Let's say that we've got our initial equilibrium again. We're looking at the graph on the right, and the equilibrium has a price of P1 and the quantity consumed being Q1. Now, let's say that the supply, that new company that is making printers, increases a lot more. And there's only a small increase in demand because of the lockdown. What's going to happen? Well, we know that the quantity consumed will go up because they've both shifted right, but the overall equilibrium price has decreased. The reason for that is because the increase in supply is greater than the increase in demand. So that's something that we've got to be aware of when analysing economics, is often the demand and the supply will shift at the same time. And we're trying to determine which one will shift larger, because that can determine which direction the price moves, if the price will go up or if the price will go down. So remember, this is a table that basically explains everything, but if the demand curve doesn't change, well, if the supply curve doesn't change, nothing changes. Quantity doesn't change, price doesn't change. But if the demand curve increases and the supply curve doesn't change, well, the quantity will increase and the price will increase. Now, and you can go through all of those boxes and you should be able to understand all of those. If any of them are not clear, bring it up with me during the tutorial. But what we just covered in the last slide was the one in the middle, where supply increases and demand increases. First off, the quantity consumed increases, but the price will increase or it will decrease. And whether it increases or decreases will depend on whether the supply or the demand increases more. So I just want to give one more example here. This is the market for poultry or chicken in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is an interesting culture in a way, because generally the Saudis, they like to eat chicken in the winter. They kind of view chicken as being a winter food, and in the summer they're much more likely to eat lamb or to eat fish and salad, because it's a fairly hot country. So in the summer you've got that demand curve as being the demand for chicken. And with the supply, you've got the price at $4.50. But in the winter, what happens? The demand for chicken goes up, but the supply stays the same because there aren't more chicken farms in the summer. And so overall, the price or there might be a slight increase in supply, but overall the demand will increase more. So overall, in the winter, the price of chicken, the price per kilo, goes up in Saudi Arabia. So one thing to keep in mind is that when the supply curve or the demand curve shifts, that does not change the other curve. If the supply curve moves and it increases the supply and that brings the price down, that doesn't mean that suddenly the demand curve moves and demand increases. No, the quantity demanded increases and the price comes down. Likewise, if the demand increases and the demand curve shifts to the right and that brings the price up, that doesn't mean that suddenly the supply curve will move up. No, because the quantity supplied will increase, but the supply will remain the same. So remember that. That's an important thing, that the supply curve doesn't chase the demand curve and the demand curve doesn't chase the supply curve. So let's look at some examples here, and I want you to look at these as examples to do in your own time, and we're going to go through these in the tutorial together. So I want to imagine that you're the manager of Abu Afif Ice Cream Parlour. A lot of my examples I use in engineering economics center around ice cream, and Abu Afif is probably my favourite place to go for ice cream. We should probably arrange a field trip to go there together at the end of the semester. But anyway, I want you to look at each of these questions and I want you to consider what is going to happen to the supply and demand curve. I want you to answer the question according to the three-step method. First off, will supply and or demand shift? And why will they shift? Will they increase or decrease? Is that going to mean that the price of ice cream will go up or it will go down? And will the quantity of ice cream consumed go up or go down? So I'll do the first one here for you. Let's say that the price of sugar for making ice cream goes up and it's very hot weather. Well, what's going to happen here is with the price of sugar going up, that means that the amount supplied for any given price will decrease. Supply will decrease because the price of an input has gone up. Also, it's very hot weather. What do people do when it's hot weather? They have ice creams. Well, that will mean that the demand will increase. So the demand will shift right and the supply will shift left. So what's that going to do to the price? Well, the price is going to go up and it's being driven both by supply and by demand. What will happen to the quantity consumed? Well, we don't actually know that. It could shift left or it could shift right. There could be more ice cream or less ice cream consumed every week. It will depend on what shifts more, if it is supply or demand. So I've just answered the first question, and I can show that to you on a board if you would prefer, if that's unclear. But I also want you to now try and do this in your own time, and I recommend drawing a supply and demand curve. It just helps It just helps with the thinking. It seems to make things easier. It's amazing when I mark final exams for this module, the number of people who've drawn little supply demand curves in the column. It seems to help. So what would happen if people's incomes in Erbil increase? What would happen if the price of petrol goes down in Erbil? What's going to happen if Kurdistan 24 publishes an article about how ice cream is good for you? It doesn't clog your arteries, it makes you into Superman. And what would happen if the KRG introduces an import tariff on cream from Turkey to Iran, meaning that from Turkey and Iran, so meaning that any cream that is imported into Erbil, there is now a tax on it. So you should be able to answer those in your own time. Let's go through another example here. Let's say that you're looking to start a double glazing market, and the person opening up this double glazing market is Iran. So Kurdistan is a very cold country in winter, and it's a very hot country in summer. And because of that, there's a demand for double glazed windows. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's a picture in the top right where basically you have windows which have two panels of glass, which means that you've got much better insulation. And Avan, she decides she's going to enter the market and she's going to open up a business called Glorious Glass. That's Avan's business. Now you can see in the bottom right hand corner the current supply and demand curve for double glazing in Kurdistan, and the current price is P1 and the quantity consumed is Q1 at the equilibrium. Now I want you to tell me, and again we'll do this in the tutorial, what will happen when the price of glass falls. Well, obviously, that's an input for double glazing windows. So if the price for the input is going down, the supply is going to increase, meaning the supply curve will shift to the right. It's not going to change the demand. The price of glass has no impact on the demand for double glazing. But if the supply curve, the blue line, shifts to the right, that means the price of double glazing is going to come down, and the quantity consumed is going to go up. That's what happens. If you can explain that, you just got 3 marks. All of these questions, they're 3-mark questions. What would happen if Turkey and Iran have a diplomatic dispute with the KRG and close the borders to trade? So suddenly Turkey and Iran are no longer trading with Kurdistan. So remember, this has happened in the past. Remember when 2-3 years ago the KRG had an illegal, by international law at least, an illegal referendum, and Turkey and Iran closed the borders to the KRG for a period of time before they were able to negotiate peace again. What would happen if Carrefour was having a sale on air conditioning units? Is an air conditioning unit, is that a complementary or supplementary good? Substitute good? Think about that. 4. The government announces that there's going to be a big pay rise for the Peshmerga. So the Peshmerga are the biggest employer in Erbil. No company hires more people than the Peshmerga. Number 5. Shana. She's seeing how much money Avan is making, and she decides to open up her own double glazing company. That should be a her, not a his, sorry. And so she opens up a double glazing company and she calls it Shababi Shana. Apologies for the Arabic. I do need to get round to learning some Kurdish at some point. Number 6. Because of climate change, Kurdistan is getting hotter year round. All through the year, it's getting hotter. Number 7, it's March. What happens in March? Think about that. Now, what would happen at number 8? Shababik Shana launches an advertising campaign for double glazing. How's that going to affect Iran? How's that going to affect the market as a whole? Think about how that graph will change. What's going to happen if the price of oil goes up? What's going to happen if the Iraqi dinar crashes? Currently, the Iraqi dinar, it's about 1,200 dinar to the US dollar. What if it crashes and there's only 2,000 dinar to the US dollar? And then Shana, she decides to marry that ugly guy that we met in lecture 1. And so she closes Shababik Shana for 1 month so that she can go on honeymoon with the ugly guy. Now, with her ugly husband. How's that going to affect the supply and demand curve? Guys, do this in your own time. This is questions that we will go through the tutorial with, but you should be able to answer these. Now, if anything that has been unclear in this, you can go to some additional resources. Alan Anderton, that book, which is available in the library, but you can purchase that book online by Kindle. It's the details for that are on the Moodle, the module descriptor. You can read pages 53 and 58 to 65. That goes through supply and demand as I've explained it. Or, and in fact I would ask that you all do this, watch and understand the supply and demand video from Crash Course in Economics. That's a video, the link for it is on the Moodle page. Well, that's all I have for you now. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you've got any questions, either contact me by email or phone call, or I'll see you in the tutorial later this week. Thank you and goodbye.